The Zarnorian Central Inventory, officially registered under the Bureau of Object Retention, began its cataloging process exactly 7,003 years before the present cycle. The first warehouse, designated Storage Bay Alpha, was opened with a total of 118 shelving units, each measured to the standard width of 4.22 units, the height of 9.76 units, and the depth of 2.11 units. Each shelf was then divided into 42 compartments, and each compartment was given a sequential alphanumeric designation beginning with A1 to 1 and continuing through A40 to 42. The earliest entries were exceedingly modest. In compartment A1 to 1, officials recorded the placement of one spherical stone, 3.2 units in diameter, gray in coloration, with surface abrasions covering approximately 14% of its exterior. The stone was not considered valuable, but the Bureau insisted on recording its presence. Its assigned identification number was Alpha O00001. Next to it, in compartment 1 to 2, they placed 3 metal shards of indeterminate origin. The shards measured 0.5, 0.7, and 1.1 units respectively, with surface corrosion categorized at level 2 on the 5-level scale. These were collectively cataloged as Alpha-00002. Progress continued slowly. Compartment A1 to 3 contained 5 fragments of woven fabric, each carefully measured. The first fragment, 12.3 by 4.4 units. The second, 7.8 by 3.2 units. The third, 5.6 by 2.9 units. The fourth, 9.1 by 3.0 units. The fifth, 3.2 by 2.1 units. All were faded to a pale green coloration, although official notes described them as unremarkable in texture. By the end of the first cataloging year, only 17 compartments were filled. Among the more noteworthy, though still dull, inclusions, a 2 to 7 contained a set of 13 identical clay pellets, each weighing 0.04 units, beige in hue, stored in a plain container with no decorative markings. A 3 to 12 was used to house a broken wooden implement, possibly a handle, measuring 11.9 units in length, with splinters extending an additional 0.2 units. A 4 to 1 stored 47 dried leaf fragments, flattened and pressed for preservation, each averaging 3.5 centimeters in width. The clerks recorded each entry with painstaking precision. The ink they used was standardized, and they noted this fact in the margins. Ink compound 3B, viscosity 0.76. Even the handwriting styles were cataloged. Scribe Florin, for instance, was known to form the curve of the 7 at a slightly sharper angle than Scribe Refill, and this deviation was carefully remarked upon in the audit logs. As centuries passed, Storage Bay Alpha grew steadily more crowded. By the end of the first 1,000 years, all 118 shelves were filled to capacity. The total number of items recorded reached 4,956,382. Notably, a majority of these were categorized as miscellaneous mineral fragments. A breakdown revealed that 62% were of igneous composition, 21% sedimentary, and the remainder uncertain due to degradation. Each mineral fragment was documented with length, width, depth, estimated density, and approximate dullness rating, which was assessed on a scale from slightly uninteresting to remarkably uninteresting. One particular highlight, if such a term can be used, was Alpha 199,884, a small metallic cube measuring exactly 1.0 unit on each side. Its sides were smooth, though one face bore a shallow indentation, depth 0.02 units, possibly from contact with another object during storage. The cube was otherwise unremarkable. Nevertheless, it required 3 separate entries in the catalog, one for its dimensions, one for its weight, and one for the indentation itself. The clerks often complained of monotony, yet the work continued generation after generation. Each new century, the inventory was reviewed in full. That meant remeasuring the 4,956,382 items, noting changes in dust accumulation, discoloration, and minor shifts in weight due to evaporation or erosion. The dust itself was separately cataloged, with each layer given a sequential number. The first layer was dust accumulation 0001, the second, dust accumulation 0002, and so forth. By the close of the first millennium, there were 100,000 distinct dust records, most averaging 0.003 units in thickness. And yet, despite the unimaginable monotony, the Bureau was proud. The Zarnorians valued order, and nothing, no matter how insignificant, was allowed to pass unrecorded. It was this attitude, they claimed, that made their empire enduring, though whether anyone cared about the 7,000-year accumulation of fabric scraps, stone fragments, or dust was another matter entirely. After the completion of the first millennium's catalog, the Bureau of Object Retention authorized an expansion of Storage Bay Alpha. The original 118 shelves were deemed insufficient for the growing volume of recorded fragments. Thus, an additional 59 shelves were constructed, bringing the total to 177 shelving units. Each new shelf matched the precise measurements of the original's width, 4.22 units, height 9.76 units, depth 2.11 units, though the carpentry clerks noted a minute variance of 0.002 units in several cases, which was immediately logged as discrepancy report 000047. Expansion coincided with the arrival of a shipment of ceramic shards excavated from the lesser moon of Zarnath. There were 4,212 shards in total, ranging in size from 0.3 to 12.8 units. Each shard was triangular in shape to some degree, though none formed a complete object when placed together. The catalog clerks devoted 16 consecutive nights to recording the dimensions of these shards. One shard in particular, Alpha 4211, measured 3.7 by 2.2 by 0.4 units. Its coloration was described as dull beige with faint speckling. This was annotated twice to ensure no scribe confused faint speckling with minor mottling. A separate shipment contained metallic pins, numbering 17,334, discovered in a disused factory. The pins were grouped into batches of 100. Each pin was 0.07 units thick and 1.1 units long. The Bureau mandated that every pin receive an individual entry despite their uniformity. This decision resulted in the creation of 17,334 new catalog lines, all of which contained nearly identical information. Clerks were instructed to add variety only in the final note of each entry: slightly reflective, very slightly reflective, or minutely reflective. This generated significant debate over the precise definition of slight, which was resolved only after 48 separate committee meetings over the next centuries. Storage Bay Alpha accumulated a remarkable quantity of wooden splinters, numbering in the millions. These were categorized by grain direction. Approximately 73% displayed parallel grain alignment, while 27% showed irregularity. The irregular splinters were further divided into subcategories: mild deviation, moderate deviation, and strong deviation. A small collection of splinters with grain patterns too chaotic to classify were assigned their own designation: non-compliant grain fragments. This subcategory alone reached 84,991 entries within the next 200 years. One of the most time-consuming undertakings was the cataloging of rope fibers. These were stored in compartment ranges A90 through A118. The fibers were each 0.002 units thick. though length varied from 2.3 to 77.4 units. Clerks measured each fiber 3 times to confirm accuracy. Variations of 0.001 units were considered significant and required remeasurement. A total of 1,203,883 measurements were taken across the rope collection, producing a report of 4,018 pages. The report itself was stored in compartment A11841, where it was given the catalog number Alpha 2,009,334. Dust accumulation continued to be recorded separately. During the second millennium, the Bureau noted that dust layers increased at an average rate of 0.004 units per century, compared to 0.003 units in the first millennium. This increase was analyzed extensively. A 1,200-page appendix concluded that the most likely cause was a minor shift in airflow within the facility, resulting from the installation of additional shelves. To compensate, clerks recommended turning each stored item 180 degrees once every 500 years to ensure even dust distribution. This procedure was immediately implemented, and new entries were created to mark the rotation date for each item. Among the more mundane items entered during this period were 8,209 buttons, most lacking holes, and 3,005 strands of unremarkable hair, all gray or brown in color. The Bureau treated these objects with the same seriousness as mineral fragments, assigning each hair strand its own compartment space. Entire shelves were dedicated exclusively to hairs, with no 2 strands permitted to touch. This policy doubled the shelf requirement for the hair collection, creating a minor storage crisis. By the close of the second millennium, Storage Bay Alpha housed a total of 12,331,007 cataloged objects. A complete re-inventory was again mandated. Clerks spent nearly 3 centuries remeasuring, dusting, and noting microscopic changes. One clerk, Scribe Thal, reportedly remarked that item Alpha 6,223,009 appears perhaps 0.00001 units shorter than before. The observation was entered as revision record 1,884, with a committee convened to debate its accuracy. The committee lasted 12 years, concluding that the object was indeed shorter. This conclusion resulted in the rewriting of 3,000 related entries, all of which had to be signed and countersigned by no fewer than 14 officials. Despite this staggering monotony, the Bureau celebrated the close of the second millennium with a commemorative plaque. The plaque itself was catalogued as Alpha 12,331,008, described as a flat sheet of metal, 2.2 units wide and 1.0 unit tall, engraved with the words, "Completion of the second millennium inventory." It was noted that the engraving was slightly misaligned to the left, an imperfection that generated 4 separate sub-reports. Thus ended the second millennium of the Zarnorian storage facility, a triumph of order, patience, and endless documentation. At the dawn of the third millennium, the Bureau of Object Retention initiated what came to be known, in its exceedingly uneventful annals, as the Great Reorganization of Bay Alpha. The purpose of this endeavor was not expansion, but rather the realignment of already stored objects. It was decreed that every item cataloged over the previous 2,000 years would be moved precisely 0.33 units to the left within its compartment. The stated reason was to improve spatial balance, although no clerk could adequately explain why spatial balance required exactly 0.33 units of lateral shift rather than 0.32 or 0.34, a total of 12,331,007. Items were therefore repositioned one by one over the course of 117 years. Each relocation required a new catalog entry. Thus, the stone originally known as Alpha O, the first item placed in the warehouse, was now relabeled as Alpha O, to denote its relocation. Similarly, all subsequent objects acquired the suffix R1. This effectively doubled the length of the catalog, which clerks deemed a remarkable achievement. Though not in terms of excitement, one curious issue arose during the relocation of the ceramic shards collection. When moved 0.33 units left, shard alpha 4211 was observed to overlap its compartment border by 0.001 units. This created a bureaucratic crisis. Debate raged for nearly 5 decades over whether this constituted improper encroachment. A resolution was finally achieved when a new subcompartment, a 42B, was created specifically to house shard alpha 4211R1. The shard was placed there, documented with 3 new entries, and the encroachment controversy officially closed. A particularly slow segment of the reorganization involved the pin collection. All 17,334 metallic pins were shifted one by one, with new reflective observations taken. For example, pin alpha 783 was recorded as minutely reflective at angle 73.4 degrees before relocation, and minutely reflective at angle 73.5 degrees after relocation. This 0.1 degree variation required a subcommittee to determine if the reflection was affected by dust layering or by the relocation itself. The subcommittee, comprised of 5 clerks, met weekly for 22 years before concluding that the variation was negligible, but still worthy of permanent documentation. Dust records expanded dramatically during this era. By relocating items, dust settled unevenly, leading to the creation of dust accumulation reports, 100,000, 1 through 150,000. Each report noted the thickness of dust before movement, the dust dislodged during movement, and the newly forming dust layer afterward. Clerks meticulously collected displaced dust into glass containers, which themselves were cataloged as separate items. By the end of the 3rd millennium, there were 47,221 dust containers stacked on shelf A176. Each container was sealed with a standard lid, yet even the lids received unique identification numbers. Among the stranger inclusions was the Bureau's decision to catalog its own shelving units. Although the shelves had been in existence for 2 millennia, no one had previously created entries for them. A corrective decree was issued. Thus, all 177 shelves were assigned catalog numbers ranging from alpha S001 through alpha S177. Each was described in painstaking detail. Shelf alpha S001. Wood composition 88% fibrous, 12% resin. Width 4.22001 units. Height 9.7598 units. Depth 2.1102 units. Slight dent on lower corner. These shelf records required yet another 12 years to complete. The Bureau also began cataloging labels themselves. Every tag affixed to every compartment, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, was described by its shape, ink consistency, and adhesive strength. Label alpha-tag-1, for instance, was noted as rectangular beige, ink density 0.63, adhesive coverage 74%. The label records soon became so numerous that they warranted their own sub-archive. Label Annex 1, constructed adjacent to Bay Alpha Dot by the end of the 3rd millennium. The catalog had ballooned to 25,002,448 entries, including original items, relocated items, dust containers, shelf records, and labels. The clerks complained of repetitive strain in their writing appendages, prompting the Bureau to introduce standardized rest intervals of 4.2 minutes per hour. The rest intervals, naturally, were themselves recorded, with logs noting when each clerk paused and resumed work. The climax of this millennium's effort came when the Bureau unveiled its comprehensive reorganization report, a tome spanning 8,842 pages. This report documented not only every relocated item, but also the methodology of shifting, the angle of each lift, and the precise amount of dust disturbed per motion. The report was so heavy it required 2 clerks to carry. After being placed in compartment A1-1842, it was formally catalogued as Alpha 25,002,449. Thus, ended the 3rd millennium of Storage Bay Alpha, not with discovery, nor innovation, but with the monumental achievement of moving every item a fraction to the left, and writing down that it had been done. As the 4th millennium began, the Bureau of Object Retention declared that the catalog of Bay Alpha, though comprehensive, lacked what they termed verification redundancy. The decree stated that every entry must be checked against itself by a 2nd clerk, and then checked again by a 3rd clerk to confirm that the 2nd clerk had performed the check correctly. This policy produced what came to be known as the triple verification system, a process that consumed nearly 900 years before reaching even partial completion. The system worked as follows. A clerk would select an item, for instance, the spherical stone Alpha 00001R1, and record its dimensions. Anew, 3.2 units in diameter, 14% surface abrasion, gray coloration. A 2nd clerk would then verify that these numbers matched the original. Finally, a 3rd clerk would verify that the 2nd clerk had, in fact, matched the numbers accurately. Each verification produced a new catalog entry. Thus, Alpha 00001R1 generated 3 new entries. Alpha 00001V1, Alpha 00001R1V2, and Alpha 00011V3. By extension, every single one of the 25,002,448 entries in the catalog was required to undergo the same process. Tripling the size of the archive almost overnight, the clerks faced numerous challenges during this undertaking. For example, when measuring the length of rope fiber Alpha 2,009,334, Clerk Varn recorded it as 77.401 units, whereas Clerk Dren recorded it as 77.400 units. Though the discrepancy amounted to only 0.001 units, the Bureau regarded it as a crisis of significant proportions. An investigative panel was formed, consisting of 7 clerks and 1 auditor. Over the course of 52 years, the panel measured the fiber 11,238 times using instruments calibrated to within 0.00000 units. In the end, the official measurement was ruled to be 77.4005 units, and both clerks were required to amend their records. The case was preserved in the archives under the designation Discrepancy Log Number 77,400 Fiber Alpha. The dust records, too, were subjected to triple verification. Dust container Alpha Dust 12,882, for example, had originally been cataloged as containing 0.0032 units of fine gray dust. Upon remeasurement, Clerk Null claimed it contained 0.0033 units, while Clerk Vef confirmed 0.0032 units, and Clerk Ron concluded that Null's figure was a result of static interference in the weighing apparatus. A compromise entry was created, 0.00325 units, rounded to 5 decimal places. This compromise itself required an additional catalog entry, Alpha Dust 12,882V3 Note 1. Labels became a notorious source of complication. Label Alpha-Tad-1 was originally described as adhesive coverage, 74%. A verification team found it to be adhesive coverage, 73.9%. The Bureau responded by commissioning a centennial adhesive study, which took 300 years to complete and produced a report spanning 6,120 pages. The report concluded that adhesive coverage could never be measured with absolute certainty due to natural adhesive shrinkage. As a result, every adhesive measurement was given a margin of error, which itself required cataloging. Thus, new entries were created: alpha-tag-1-margin 1, alpha-tag 0001 margin 2, and so forth. Shelves 2 did not escape redundancy. Shelf alpha S001, previously described as 4.22001 units wide, was remeasured at 4.22000 units. This minor shift led to the creation of shelf dimensional variance reports 1 through 177, each report dedicated to a single shelf. Clerks argued extensively over whether the change constituted shrinkage or simply human error. Ultimately, both explanations were accepted, with each explanation given equal weight and permanent entry into the catalog. Workload of the clerks expanded so drastically that new positions were created: clerk second verifier and clerk third verifier of second verifiers. Each was responsible for checking not only objects, but also the work habits of their colleagues. Break times, previously noted as 4.2 minutes per hour, were themselves verified thrice over. If a clerk rested for 4.19 minutes, it was considered a discrepancy requiring additional reports by the close of the fourth millennium. The catalog contained an astonishing 75,007,344 entries, most of which repeated information already known, yet arranged in slightly different ways to reflect the verification layers. The Bureau declared this expansion a triumph of diligence, noting that no empire in history had ever recorded so many redundant details. The crowning achievement was the creation of the Master Verification Index, a bound volume of 12,448 pages listing every verified item in numerical order. Each page was bordered by lines exactly 0.02 units thick, though one page was discovered to have lines 0.021 units thick. This anomaly produced a flurry of memos lasting 80 years, eventually concluding that the thicker line was acceptable so long as it was acknowledged in perpetuity. The page was given its own catalog number, alpha-verification-page-8442. Thus ended the fourth millennium, an era remembered, if remembered at all, for its endless cycles of checking, rechecking, and confirming that the checking had been correctly checked. As the fifth millennium dawned, the Bureau of Object Retention decided that the numbering system used in the catalog was insufficiently descriptive. Though each entry already bore a unique alphanumeric designation, officials argued that the absence of subclassification codes might confuse future archivists who required additional clarity. Thus began the Reclassification Program, a project intended to reorganize every object, dust particle, and shelf plank into no fewer than 12 distinct subcategories. The program required that each entry be assigned a primary descriptor code (PDC), followed by a secondary descriptor code (SDC), and finally a tertiary descriptor code (TDC). For instance, the spherical stone alpha 000001, which had already been measured, verified, and re-verified across centuries, was now designated as alpha 0001 or 1PDC STNDC SPHDC Gray. Descriptors indicated that it was a stone STN, spherical SPH, and gray in color GRY. The clerks were tasked with applying such codes to all 75,007,344 catalog entries. The work began in earnest, but quickly produced a flood of disagreements. Was a rope fiber to be coded as OROPFB or orb, or should the organic tag be replaced with PLN to signify its plant origin? The matter escalated to the Committee of Terminological Standardization, which convened for 150 years. At last, they decreed that ropes were to be classified as ROPFB or PLN. though exceptions existed for ropes coated in resin, which required the additional suffix "reyes." The dust samples generated particular difficulties. Dust container alpha dust 12,882, which had already been measured at 0.00325 units, was assigned the code DSTPWDFNE. Yet some clerks objected that "fine" was a subjective term and preferred DS to PDmin. An exhaustive study was launched to compare the diameter of dust grains across 4,220 samples. After centuries of weighing, sieving, and viewing dust under magnification, the Bureau declared that fine dust was any particle less than 0.0021 units in diameter, while minimal dust was defined as less than 0.00205 units. To prevent overlap, all dust was thus given dual classification, FNE-min, each requiring its own catalog entry. Labels proved no less complex. Label alpha-tag-1, originally noted for its adhesive coverage, was now coded as LBLA-DHPRT. However, some clerks insisted that the partial adhesive property could not be adequately described without reference to its rectangular shape. As a result, the code was expanded to LBLA-DHPRT-REC. When clerks found a second label of nearly identical shape, but with 0.1% less adhesive, it required a new classification, LBL-ADH-PRT-REC-SUG. The sheer volume of classification soon overwhelmed the catalog. To solve this, the Bureau introduced color supplements, a set of ledgers bound with covers in 12 shades, ranging from pale gray to slightly paler gray. Each color signified a different subcategory. Clerks spent decades arguing whether the ledgers themselves required cataloging, and when they decided that they did, each ledger was given a descriptor code of its own. Thus, Ledger Gray 07 became LDGCVR Gray as H7. The clerks also debated the status of the shelving units. Shelf Alpha East 001, once noted for its precise width, was reclassified as SHFSTRMTL. Later, when traces of oxidation were discovered, it was updated to SHFASTRMTL-OX1. This created confusion because nearby shelf Alpha S002, also oxidized, displayed oxidation at a slightly different hue. After 6 decades of comparison, clerks determined that oxidation on S001 was OX1A, while S002 was OX1B. This necessitated a new branch of coding, expanding the catalog by tens of thousands of new entries. The reclassification program also affected clerks themselves. Every worker was assigned an identification code to ensure proper accountability. Clerk Vern, for example, became CLRKORGPRM0123. His duties were labeled as CLRKDT-RPT, and his scheduled break periods were noted as CLRKB-RKSTD04. These codes were logged alongside the objects they handled, ensuring that every action was traceable across millennia. By the end of the 5th millennium, the catalog had ballooned to an unfathomable 225,022,032 entries. Officials celebrated this as a triumph of organization, though the majority of entries were mere permutations of previous data expressed in more elaborate codes. A final report, the Grand Descriptor Compendium, spanned 18,442 volumes. Each volume contained indexes of indexes, cross-references of cross-references, and multiple sections listing obsolete codes that were nonetheless preserved for historical integrity. The millennium closed without a single object being removed, altered, or lost. Yet the catalog had become so vast that simply opening it to the correct section required no fewer than 3 clerks and 6 hours of searching. The Bureau deemed this inefficiency acceptable, for inefficiency was, in their view, the natural consequence of perfection. When the sixth millennium commenced, the Bureau of Object Retention concluded that the catalog, though extensive and fully coded, lacked cross-references. They argued that future clerks might struggle to connect related entries without additional guides. Thus began the Cross-Referencing Initiative, a project that would consume over 1,000 years and produce an ocean of redundancy unlike anything previously seen. The system required that every item be linked to every other item with which it shared even the faintest characteristic. The spherical stone alpha 00001 1 PD C STN STC G Aquach DC G RY, for example, was cross-referenced with other stones, other spheres, and other gray objects. This meant links to rope fiber alpha 2,009,334 because it was gray, dust sample alpha dust 12,882 because it was round in its container, and even label alpha tag 000 because its faded adhesive resembled gray coloration. Each cross-reference created a new catalog entry, CRF 00022009334, CRF 00000 1,882, and so forth. Clerks soon realized the exponential scale of this task. With 225,022,032 existing entries, the number of possible cross-references reached into the trillions. To cope, the Bureau introduced the sequential cross-reference ledger system. Each ledger documented 10,000 connections, meticulously handwritten columns exactly 0.2 units wide. Every column was bordered with ink lines, and the thickness of these lines was recorded, verified, and corrected if necessary. The ink itself was measured for viscosity. One infamous batch of ink produced lines of 0.2001 units instead of 0.20000, sparking debates that lasted 90 years. Disputes erupted over the basis of connections. Clerk Dren argued that dust sample alpha dust 8821 should be linked to shelf alpha SO44 because dust often accumulated on shelves. Clerk Veth objected, claiming such links were speculative rather than inherent. The Bureau created the Committee on Legitimate Associations, which met for 220 years before ruling that dust-to-shelf associations were permissible only if verified by physical evidence of dust having once touched the shelf. This ruling generated the Dust Contact Sub-Archive, a completely separate catalog recording microscopic traces of dust found on 42,331 shelves. Labels required their own web of cross-references. Label alpha tag 002, being rectangular, was linked to shelf alpha S011, also rectangular. But some argued that this was not a true connection because one was flat while the other was vertical. The debate culminated in a massive document, the Rectangular Association Protocol, stretching across 4,112 pages. It concluded that rectangles must be subdivided into horizontal and vertical categories, producing yet more catalog numbers. Shelves themselves became points of obsession. Shelf alpha S001, once cataloged for its precise width and oxidation, was now linked to every item it had ever supported. This meant connections to 1,442 boxes, 332 labels, and at least 22 dust samples. Each connection was not merely noted, but assigned its own verification layer. Thus, shelf to box 1442 required CRFSHF001BOX 1442V1, V2, and V3 entries. The clerk's activities were also cross-referenced. Clerk Varn, CLRKORP RM0123, was linked to every object he had cataloged, and Clerk Dren was linked to every verification he had signed. Even their schedule breaks were cross-referenced. CLRKBRKSTD04 was linked to the benches on which they rested. producing catalog entries like CRFBRK04 bench 001 soon. The act of resting became as thoroughly archived as the warehouse itself. The overwhelming task necessitated a new building, the Hall of Cross-References. This structure consisted of 1,122 aisles, each holding ledgers bound in covers of subtly different shades of beige. The aisles were mapped with extraordinary precision, down to the angle of each shelf bracket. Predictably, the maps were cataloged and cross-referenced with the objects contained within, so that a ledger describing cross-references itself possessed thousands of its own cross-dash references. By the end of the 6th millennium, the catalog had swollen beyond calculation. The official figure was declared to be 1,337,112,884,221 entries, though clerks admitted privately that they had lost count somewhere in the middle. The Bureau nevertheless proclaimed victory, stating that the galaxy had never before known such thorough documentation of relationships between dust, shelves, ropes, and labels. Perhaps the most telling summary was inscribed at the close of the Grand Cross-Reference Index, volume 9882. Nothing exists in isolation. Every object is bound to every other object by ties of dust, shape, or color. All such ties must be written, even if no one shall ever read them. At the dawn of the 7th millennium, the Bureau of Object Retention raised a new concern, while the catalog entries, codes, and cross-references had grown vast beyond comprehension. The objects themselves might decay. To prevent such loss, they launched the preservation protocols, an effort to record, preserve, and then record the act of preservation itself in equally exhaustive fashion. The first step was to determine the optimal environmental conditions. Committees were formed to measure temperature, humidity, and light within the storage facility. For 3 centuries, clerks compared readings from thermometers placed at intervals of exactly 0.2 units across the aisles. One thermometer recorded a temperature of 19.999 units, while another read 20.000 units. This discrepancy consumed 80 years of debate. The compromise figure of 19.9995 units was adopted, though both original values were preserved in the catalog with distinct preservation entries. Humidity proved even more contentious. Clerk Veff insisted that 44.2% humidity best prevented dust clumping, while Clerk Dren argued for 44.3%. The Bureau responded by creating the Humidity Ledger, a bound volume of 7,722 pages describing every measured fluctuation in humidity across 900 years. Eventually, the Bureau announced that both 44.2% and 44.3% were acceptable, provided that they were each preserved in alternating cycles. This led to the construction of the dual humidity chambers, identical rooms where objects were rotated every 1,000 days to ensure equal exposure to both. Conditions objects were then sealed in protective casings. The spherical stone alpha 00001 R1 was placed in a transparent cube of hardened polymer, catalogued as CSESTNSPH000N. The casing itself was assigned dimensions, codes, and verification numbers, which required their own cross-references. Thus, the act of placing the stone inside a box tripled the number of associated entries. When clerks debated whether the polymer was more translucent than transparent, the Bureau launched the transparency study, lasting 240 years, to measure the light-passing capacity of the casing to 4 decimal places. Dust samples received particular attention. Container alpha dust 12,882 was double-sealed in a glass vial placed within a larger container. The vial was logged as VILD ST12882, while the container was logged as CST VILD ST12882. Each seal required testing for air leakage. producing reports that spanned centuries. A notable entry describes how Clerk Ron observed a minute crack, measuring 0.00002 units. Though subsequent clerks could not detect it, the Bureau resolved this by cataloging the crack as both present and absent, creating parallel records that remain to this day. Shelves were coated with preservation lacquer. Shelf Alpha ISO 01 was brushed with a thin layer measuring 0.0021 units thick, while Shelf Alpha ISO 02 received a layer of 0.0022 units. These minute differences were cataloged, debated, and then preserved in reports known as the lacquer thickness registers. Over time, the lacquer itself began to crack, prompting yet another layer of lacquer to be applied. The Bureau declared that each application required its own catalog entry, thereby generating an infinite cycle of lacquer records. Labels, fragile as they were, demanded their own preservation ritual. Label Alpha Tag L001 was laminated between two sheets of archival plastic. Yet clerks soon noticed that the lamination altered the adhesive coverage by 0.01%. This discovery triggered a cascade of new entries, one for the adhesive before lamination, one for after lamination, and one for the act of lamination itself. To this day, the label's catalog record contains more entries than any other object, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Bureau also decreed that the act of preservation must be preserved. Thus, when Clerk Varn applied lacquer to shelf SO01, the action was itself documented, sealed in a box, and cataloged. The record of him sealing the box was also preserved, and so on. This recursion of preservation became known as the Infinite Protocol. Many clerks complained that their duties had become impossible, but the Bureau insisted that impossibility was no excuse for incompletion. By the close of the 7th millennium, the catalog had grown so immense that no one could hope to consult it in a lifetime. The official count reached 9,442,332,118,221 entries, though clerks suspected the true figure was even higher, since not all recursive preservation actions had been fully written. The Bureau nonetheless hailed the age as a triumph, proclaiming, "To preserve is to exist, and to record preservation is to preserve existence." Thus ended another millennium in which nothing happened except dust being sealed, shelves lacquered, and labels laminated, all in the name of perfection that no one would ever read. As the 8th millennium unfolded, the Bureau of Object Retention came to a solemn realization. While the catalog contained records of objects, verifications, reclassifications, cross-references, and preservation acts, it did not yet contain a record of the catalog itself. This omission was considered catastrophic, for how could future generations understand the catalog if the catalog's own existence was not fully cataloged? Thus began the final, and perhaps most unending, chapter, the Meta-Documentation Initiative. The first order of business was to catalog the physical catalog volumes. Volume 1 of the Grand Descriptor Compendium, once merely a ledger, was now assigned the code Vol G DC0001. Its binding, made of reinforced polymer, was measured at 3.221 units tall and 2.14 units wide. Its spine curvature was measured to 4 decimal places, producing entries such as VOGDC0001 SPCCRV 0.0021. Ink density of each letter was measured, and when the density varied slightly between the letter A on page 14 and the letter A on page 22, the Bureau declared both to be distinct catalog entries. This act of cataloging the catalog was extended to every volume, every page, and every line. By the time clerks reached volume 2418, the catalog had already expanded by trillions of entries. Each entry contained not only object data but also notes on the page margins. the alignment of the text, and the thickness of the paper fibers themselves. When one page was found to have a fiber density of 0.0023 units, compared to 0.0022 units in another, the Bureau ruled that both must be preserved separately, creating duplicate yet indispensable entries. The indexes of indexes became another layer of obsession. Cross-reference index volume 9882, once thought complete, was now itself cross-referenced with index volumes 9883 and 9884, each link producing dozens of new catalog numbers. Clerks noted that each index referred to objects which referred to other objects, and so they began writing catalogs of the indexes, known as meta-indexes. Soon, the facility held ledgers dedicated solely to listing where other ledgers listed ledgers. Preservation was, naturally, applied to the catalog itself. The Grand Descriptor Compendium was sealed in polymer cases, laminated in protective layers, and locked inside shelves whose lacquer had been measured to the nearest 0.0001 units. The preservation of these ledgers was also preserved, producing records like CSEVOLGDC000, CSEVOLGDC001, and Presses TSES EVOLGDC001. The recursion multiplied endlessly. Clerks themselves were not spared. Every action they performed while documenting the catalog was itself documented. Clerk Varn's act of writing, VOG DC0001, on page 3 was preserved as Varnwright Volg DC0001 PG3. The act of documenting that he had written, it was preserved as Meta-Varn-Write-001. When Clerk Dren checked Varn's entry, it was preserved as Dren Verify Varn Varity EOOI TEO01. And when Clerk Ron verified that Dren had verified correctly, another record was added. Thus, the catalog became a living mirror reflecting itself endlessly, layer upon layer. Eventually, the Bureau realized that the catalog had become so recursive that even the idea of cataloging had been cataloged. This produced philosophical debates recorded in volumes known as the Treatises of Infinite Record. These treatises argued that the catalog might never end, because every attempt to complete it created new entries requiring documentation. One treatise concluded, "To end the catalog is to fail it, and to continue the catalog is to never end it. Thus, the catalog is eternal. By the close of the 8th millennium, the official number of catalog entries was declared to be uncountable. Some clerks claimed it exceeded 100 trillion, while others argued the figure was meaningless since the act of counting itself created new entries. The Bureau, ever faithful to procedure, cataloged both opinions, adding them as permanent entries. In its final decree of the era, the Bureau stated, "All things have been recorded. All records have been preserved. All preservation has been preserved. All records of records shall continue until the end of time. Nothing has been omitted except perhaps the possibility of omission, which is now duly recorded." Thus concluded the 8th millennium of the Zarnorian storage facility, where nothing of consequence ever occurred. Yet everything was written, measured, sealed, and endlessly cataloged, until even the act of sleep itself could be considered an entry.